This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Do you know how to sew? Or maybe you're learning. Over the last 2 years, Americans picked up sewing when there was a need to make masks at the start of the pandemic. For others, it became a new hobby. Sewing is an important skill, and it can be empowering to be able to make or tailor your own clothes. Online sewing communities have grown to help teach the craft or provide technical help with sewing machines recently purchased or passed down from family members. Today, Where We Live, we talk with local residents about sewing, and later we learn about the Norwalk Community Quilt Project. Quilters, stitchers, and sewers, we want to hear from you. Join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter @Where We Live. Joining us first on Zoom is Laura Kasowitz, who's owner of Hartford Stitch, a sewing school in West Hartford. Laura, welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So tell us about when you opened Hartford Stitch and, where the idea came from.
So I opened Hartford Stitch about 6.5 years ago. I had 2 small children at the time. They were 3 and almost 1. And I was kind of just looking for something else to do outside of my house. I love to sew. And people would often say, "Oh, I can't sew. I failed home ec. I have 2 left thumbs." And I thought, well, this isn't that hard. I can teach them. And my goal was to just do like 1 private lesson a week. But over the past almost 7 years, things have snowballed. And we now have an in-person sewing school we have had for 6 years. And we teach between 50 and 70 kids and adults a week how to sew.
I chuckled when you mentioned how some people react to sewing, telling you that they failed home ec. I remember when I had home ec, I had to make a windsock, and it did not turn out very well, Laura, but I do know how to sew a button on and fix a seam that may be ripping. So those are my skills. But I'm wondering...
No, those are the essential ones.
Right. So tell me more. So obviously you started this long before the pandemic, and with this surge in people that are interested in learning how to make their own clothes. Tell me more about the people that are coming to you to either learn or become better sewers.
Yeah, so we teach about probably 50% are kid students and 50% are adults. And I like to say that sewing is creative, practical, and empowering. And we definitely get people here for all those reasons. Some people are just looking for a new hobby, a new craft, and sewing seems like fun, which it is. Some people are looking for ways to connect maybe with a parent or a grandparent that used to sew and they never learned from them, but now have all of their sewing stuff and sewing machines. And so it's something they want to pick up. So they have that connection. And then there's people that come in, maybe they are pregnant or about to or have a small child and they want to learn to make Halloween costumes and not buy them. And then people that are looking to sew their own clothing, whether it's they're more petite and they want to hem pants because they're tired of paying somebody to do it, or they have ideas for a fashion line, or they want to learn to upcycle clothing, or they don't like the way clothes that they buy in a store fit them. And so they want to learn how to either make their own or to alter their own clothes. So the reasons just really, they run a gamut. We kind of see everything here. And we consider ourselves a hobbyist school. So it's people at home that are looking to practice their craft and learn a new craft.
Andrea shared a picture with us on social media of scrappy quilted trivets, and she writes, "Sewing kept me sane during my pregnancy early on in the pandemic." Does that sound familiar, Laura?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I definitely had many students and students' parents reach out to me early in the pandemic saying that, especially those first 2 weeks to stay home, that they really dove into sewing, and it was a great thing to focus their energy and keep their mind off of what else might be going on. It's one of those great crafts that you can come to a school and do it. You can do it with friends. You can do it at home, and you can find materials anywhere. So it serves a lot of purposes.
You also are involved in some community-driven initiatives around the ability to sew or to help people either learn or to acquire sewing machines. I understand you got involved with a refugee resettlement agency recently. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this was very unexpected. The middle of December, a woman reached out to me and said that she had just picked up a sewing machine off of a Buy Nothing Facebook page and wanted to know if I could just take a look at it to see if it worked. And she's a volunteer with Iris, which is out of New Haven, which is a resettlement agency. And when she came to the studio, we started talking, and she mentioned that obviously these families did not come over with sewing machines. And beyond that, the women were having difficulty finding clothes that they were comfortable in, that fit their style. They weren't able just to go to our local stores and find what they were used to wearing, but they knew how to sew. So if they had a sewing machine and fabric, then they could have that little extra comfort. And I said, well, if you think more people can use them, I know I can get you more sewing machines. We had done a sewing machine drive last December, for an organization in Hartford, and the sewing community is super generous, and a lot of people have extra sewing machines around. And so I put out a Facebook post or social media, and I think within 48 hours, I had a few pledged to me. And then some local news outlets picked it up. And within 2 weeks, I think that between the two of us, we had received close to 400 emails and calls. And when all was said and done, we brought in over 30 sewing machines and material and scissors and buttons and zippers and like every sewing tool you can think of. And I'm still getting calls actually daily, even though my particular drive has ended. But it was a really wonderful outpouring of support. And it was a kind of a crazy couple weeks there, but it was really wonderful to be able to come together and to do that for our new neighbors.
That sounds really great to hear that outpouring. For listeners who are interested in donating, whether it's a sewing machine or to help Iris with these efforts, you can contact Iris in New Haven, and we'll be sure to share a link or tweet it out on our social media. Again, you're hearing Laura Kasowitz here on Where We Live, owner of Hartford Stitch, a sewing school in West Hartford, as we talk about sewing, something that a lot of people have picked up or maybe have restarted after learning many years ago in home ec. I know it's now called, I believe, Consumer Family and Consumer Sciences, the course that's
if they even have it anymore. Yeah.
Right. And that's an important point. I know we talked about that on the show a couple years ago, Laura, that those classes are not very common. And so is that something that you're also hearing from families where they want their children to learn and there's no real place for them to do it, at least in the school setting?
Yeah, absolutely. The lack of home ec, if you will, in classes is something or in schools is something I feel is really missing. And not necessarily that everyone needs to learn to use the sewing machine, but just like you said, to mend clothing, to sew back on a button. I think those are just essential life skills. And it's a shame that kids aren't necessarily learning it. But we have lots of kids that come here. We also have adults that maybe kind of miss the end of the home ec family consumer science time. And so they're looking to pick up those skills that they didn't get in school. It really is empowering to be able to sew. Fabric and sewn goods are everywhere. And when you learn the craft, you start to really appreciate it more, which I think is really important.
You can join us 888-720-9677 if you're a quilter, a stitcher, a sewer. If you have questions for Laura, again, Laura Kasowitz, who's owner of Hartford Stitch, a sewing school in West Hartford. Stephanie's calling in with a question. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Well, I was just calling because I wanted to comment on another aspect of this sewing world that is beneficial, which is that a person like Laura, who my daughter has been sewing with since her studio opened, has taught young people the power of sewing to do things like mending their own clothes and taking, some ownership of making things for themselves, but also giving back. So the community quilting day that she organizes, she's done things where young people work with senior citizens at a senior center to partner up and make projects. She's helped in the refugee resettlement process by teaching kids in the community about the importance of providing sewing machines and fabric and other things for people who are new to our communities and need some help. Or there are many other examples, making masks for healthcare workers at the beginning of the pandemic. And I just think that's an important lesson for young people to know about the power that they have in terms of civic engagement and giving back. And that's one of the special things about Hartford Stitch in our community.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for sharing that with us here on the show. Hazel in Mystic has a question. Hazel, go ahead.
Hi, yes, it's great to hear your show. I've seen a huge uptick in enthusiasm for upcycling. I host a meetup for adults, and then I've been teaching upcycling classes to kids here. And I was wondering two things. One, I'd like to hear your definition of upcycling, because for me, it's not only enhancing textiles. I usually stick with textiles, but it's also sort of like an art form for me and a way of meditation almost. And then also, I was wondering, do you have any small projects you could help me think of ideas to teach these kids over? We're doing it over Zoom. I've done some small basic sewing, and they loved the hand sewing that I've given them, these projects. And we've been making sock monsters and things like that. Do you have anything that's maybe a step above that? Thank you.
Laura, go ahead.
Sure. So I agree with you about upcycling. I mean, to me, upcycling is anything that already exists that you then change to do something else with. So we do get a lot of people in here that want to upcycle clothing, whether that's to put some sort of kind of flair on it, or it's to completely take it apart and use it for a different type of purpose, whether it's jeans into bags or combining shirts and jackets. And it does become an art form, just like I feel like most sewing is, just because you kind of have to think really creatively about how you're going to do that. There's not necessarily patterns or step-by-step examples of how to upcycle something. So I agree with you totally that it's an art form, and it's a wonderful way to use sewing. As for projects, if these actually can be done with hand sewing or sewing machines, we find that really popular ones are scrunchies. Scrunchies are really big, and they're a pretty straightforward project to make. Those are really fun. Eye masks, like sleep masks. I don't actually know if kids really use them, but they love to make them. So that's a good one. And that is a great one to do upcycling because you can make it with scraps. So we use a lot of our fleece scraps and flannel scraps to make eye masks. Simple little pouches. So kind of sewing two pieces of fabric together and turning it inside out and folding it into thirds and sewing up the sides. Kids love things that they can put stuff in. I mean, don't we all? But there's something very cool about that. So snack pouches are definitely a big starter project. And then, of course, pillows. Kids love to make pillows. Kids would make pillows all day long if they could. So I try to kind of find ways to make it a pillow, but maybe something a little bit different, whether they sew on a felt applique to the outside or they make a pillow in a different shape. But pillows are really a great way. I believe a lot in repetition when sewing with kids. And pillows are a great way to get that repetition and get that practice in, but find new ways to kind of put their own creative stamp on it.
Before I take another call, Laura, you mentioned using fabrics and being conscious about, not creating waste. I'm wondering if you can give tips for our listeners about that aspect of when you learn to sew, you're able to have a better impact, learn to be more sustainable as well.
Yeah, so, at its core, sewing creates waste. And unfortunately, because it is a craft that takes a lot of practice to get the individual skills, or if you're sewing garments and you're trying to make something to fit you, you may have to make it a few times. It is just going to create waste. It just is. But you can use fabrics around your house that may have otherwise been destined for a donation bin. Or trash. Donations don't always end up where we think they're going to end up. So if you have blankets or sheets, I love using old sheets, especially when I'm testing out a new garment pattern, because otherwise, once you're done with sheets, you don't really have too much of a use for them. So that's a great place. I know a local sewing artist that makes wonderful coats out of old towels, like 1970s towels. So you can definitely find a lot of fabric around your house, even, or if you ask friends, I'm sure they have it as well, that you can use to create, to sew with. And then as far as sustainability goes, if your focus is on clothing, like I said, it may take a few versions to get it to where you want it to be. But I find that when you make something, whether it's sewn or otherwise, you're more likely to handle it, treat it with care, and be more conscious of how you use it and how you take care of it. So it becomes much less disposable than perhaps something that you just buy at a store. And so in the long run, that does become more sustainable when you become more of a creator and less just of a consumer.
Coming up, we're going to be learning and talking more about quilting, and I'm thinking about, can these scraps be used for quilting, perhaps, Laura?
Yeah, and scraps can always be used for quilting. I mean, that's that's the wonderful thing. So we create a lot of scraps in our studio. Stephanie mentioned our community quilt days. A couple of times a year, we have an open studio day, and I do it with my classes throughout the week, where we just sew those scraps into beautiful patchwork quilts that get donated to local organizations. So it's a little bit harder with garment fabric sometimes to kind of use every little scrap, but when it comes to quilting, you definitely can.
Caroline's calling in from Winstead. Caroline, go ahead. We have about a minute to go.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I think this is such an important topic. When I was a kid, my mom taught me how to sew. I made my own clothes. It was fun. It was in the 80s and 70s and 80s. I made all sorts of neat clothes. But because I had that skill, I ended up designing, when I was pregnant, I had really bad issues and pelvic floor issues. I ended up designing a product which I then marketed and sell because I had that sewing skill. And I continued to develop marketing medical devices for pelvic issues because of the skills that I had. So, my background was in science and I had design background, and the sewing just fit in so perfectly to the whole equation. I wouldn't even have my business if I didn't have that sewing skills that my mom and my home ec class taught me in school. So I thank you for this information, and I think I'm a perfect example of how sewing skills end up something that you had no idea that you'd ever be doing, but just because of circumstances created my whole end of my whole career.
Well, I love the story. Thank you, Caroline from Winstead, for calling in. Laura, thank you for your time learning about your business. Again, owner of Hartford Stitch, a sewing school in West Hartford, how sewing can help build a community, and also it's empowering as well. Laura, thank you for your time today on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up, we talk to another local resident about sewing and about the reasons why she makes her own clothes. Now, are you a sewer or have you picked up the skill again? You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about sewing and how the skill can empower people and help strengthen communities. Are you a sewer, a stitcher, a quilter? Join us at 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Coming up later, we learn about the Norwalk Community Quilt Project. First, we've been hearing from local residents who sew or who are learning. Joining us now on Zoom is Tamanna Rahman, a psychiatric nurse practitioner. She lives in New Haven, and she sews her own clothes. Tamanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Lucy.
So tell us when you started or maybe picked up sewing again and some of the reasons why you decided you wanted to be able to sew your own clothes.
Sure. So, a lot of what Laura said really resonated with me. I started learning to sew about 4 years ago, and it was because of the reason a lot of women have. Clothes in stores don't really fit us. As a very small South Asian woman, finding clothes that fit me has always been a nightmare. So that was definitely a driving concern for me. Learning to make my clothes has been incredibly empowering, as Laura mentioned, for multiple reasons. A big kind of factor for me, even before I started learning to sew, was finding a way to kind of opt out of fast fashion. My family's from Bangladesh, and if there's one thing, I think a lot of people know about Bangladesh, it's that it's one of the biggest garment producers in the world. And I think a thing a lot of people may also remember is when the Rana Plaza factory collapse happened in 2013. When over 1,100 garment workers were killed in a matter of minutes. And I think that really brought home for me the cost of what it means to go to Target or the mall and buy a cheap piece of clothing. You mentioned in my intro that I'm a nurse, but before this, I was a union organizer. And for me, doing that work was really rooted in the basic idea that all people should have work that has dignity and meaning. But I think even at a more fundamental level than that, I just don't think that anyone should have to die in their workplace so that we can buy like cheap disposable garments. So being able to sew my own things has been just such a powerful way to not have to participate in that cycle.
I'm glad you mentioned some of the personal reasons, Tamanna, when we think about even the consequences of fast fashion, as you mentioned, unsafe garment factories, even river pollution, and ways that you can work to not participate in the fast fashion industry. So tell me about the clothes that you make, and a little bit more about, when you're sewing, where do you find community? Are there others that you found where you live that help you, or that you feel that you're part of?
Yeah, so I think that's the thing that's been really fun and exciting about this process is that as I've been kind of on this journey, and I'm very much an amateur sewist still, so I'm learning, but I do pretty much make all of my own clothes now. Posting things on Facebook, social media, I've just had so many friends kind of surface who I realize are also taking part in these creative practices. So I've found a lot more of the community online rather than in person. I think it's been a little bit harder for me locally to find other makers, other women of color, other people who are kind of interested in the same types of things that I am. But I've found such a vibrant kind of online community of people who are thinking about sustainability and slow fashion and bringing different textile and embroidery traditions from all over the world to their practice. So it's been just an incredibly creative and fun space.
I've seen some of the images of clothes that you made online, Tamanna, and you know how to do decorative top stitching, pipe seams, pleated sleeves, gathered bodices. It's really impressive, and this is something that you were learning over the last 4 years.
Yeah. So I think it's just been a matter of every new thing I sew, I make a lot of mistakes and, I learn a new skill, and it's just kind of building on each one as I go. So yeah, I think right now I've kind of gotten confident enough to be able to pick up any pattern or anything I want to make, kind of draft it myself and figure out how to put it together, which is just such a fun process.
Leif called in from Reading just to share that Leif learned to sew in home ec class as a kid and has been sewing ever since. It's a great way to not send clothes to a landfill. How has your family responded to your sewing, Tamanna?
Yeah, I was kind of laughing when Laura was talking about, kind of using things from around your house and old bed sheets and whatever, because I do use anything and everything I can get my hands on. And I remember one time I actually like saved up and bought this like, expensive Japanese fabric. And I was really like proud to show my mom the shirt that I made with it. And I went over there and she was like, "Oh, that's beautiful. Was that a tablecloth? Is that one of your tablecloth shirts?" It's like, "No, Mom, this one is not actually a tablecloth." But yeah, I mean, my family is super supportive and they love seeing kind of the transformations that I make with whatever I find lying around.
Now, I understand you know how to make lace, or you once did, Tamanna?
I do not know how to make lace. I definitely can't claim that I know how. Okay. But yeah, so I, as a mental health care provider, that's what I do professionally. My specialty has been in working with people with trauma. So I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about how our histories, our memories, our experiences are literally encoded in our bodies. And that's been very true for me as I've been sewing. As I've like started working with textiles, all these memories from 25 years ago of sewing with my grandmother have been surfacing. So I'm like remembering that she taught me how to knit and how to make lace and how to crochet. And, she died a few years ago. And because she lived in Bangladesh, I think that death never really hit home for me. It was something that I never really grieved. And it's really been kind of in my sewing practice that these memories are like surfacing, and sort of the fact of her absence has been a little bit more present for me. But also it's just kind of given me a way to realize the ways that she is still present in the kind of craft that I'm doing now, and also in the ways that she will continue to be present as I pass on these skills to my own daughter. So that's just been a really kind of powerful part of the journey for me.
Thank you for sharing that with us. You're hearing Tamanna Rahman here on Where We Live, a psychiatric nurse practitioner living in New Haven who sews her own clothes. Some of you listening right now may have learned or taken up sewing during the pandemic, especially when the CDC first began recommending mask wearing in 2020. My next guest co-authored a study on the home sewers movement during this time. Dr. Addie Martindale is assistant professor of fashion merchandising and apparel design at Georgia Southern University. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, Lucy. It's great to be here.
So I understand you study a broad range of women and their sewing habits for clothing. And so tell us about what made you work on this study with your peers.
So me and my coworkers, Dr. Charity Armstead at Brenau University and Dr. Ellen McKinney at Iowa State University, have been studying home sewers for several years. We have all, studied apparel design and either teach apparel design now or passive taught apparel design and sewing. And we've been engaged in the home sewing community. And at the onset of the pandemic, we really saw something interesting happening. Our Instagram feeds were changing. The home sewers we were following and engaging with were starting to sew masks, and we really wanted to tell the story of what was going on.
And so you found in the study that this was a means of control for some who wanted to help in some way, and they were able to do this by making masks.
Right. So what we did is we looked at the Instagram post and we did a qualitative study because we really wanted to, this research to tell the actual story of the participants. And what we found was overall sewing masks gave people a sense of control in a time when they had no control. And within this, we found 5 sub-themes. And I just wanted to talk about 3 because I think they're most relevant to today a little bit. And one was rising to the occasion. It was really empowering to see these posts where women, typically it was women, sometimes men, were posting about the sense of accomplishment they were feeling sewing the mask and how many masks they sewed, and they were proud of how many hours they sewed. And then you saw these posts that were like, I'm ready for this. That's the theme we put to it. And it gave sewers were so confident in having the skills and the supplies that they needed to take this on. And it served as really a justification for all the time they had spent in the past sewing and the skills that they developed, and it justified them having their fabric stashes and their stashes of notions and the large collection of sewing related items. But for me, the most impactful theme was the one of this is helping me cope. So the sense of control that mask making gave them provided the sewers a way to cope with their unsettling situation. They talked about how it helped them control their emotions. It provided this calming practice. They could get in flow and forget about what was going on in the outside world. And it was a way to use nervous energy and avoid media consumption. But what was really one important thing to note was, like in our previous studies, we found that this participation in social media specifically provided a sense of community, kind of like Tamanna was talking about, so they could come together even though they couldn't come together in person and support each other and build a community in order to solve a problem.
This is really interesting to hear. Again, Dr. Addie Martindale's assistant professor at Georgia Southern University, the study that she co-authored on the home sewers movement, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. We have a link on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Thank you so much for your time and talking about the findings from this study.
Thank you so much, and thank you for talking about this sewing, because I believe it's so empowering and so important.
Tamanna Rahman was also here, a psychiatric nurse practitioner living in New Haven who sews her own clothes. Tamanna, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, we're going to talk about quilting with the woman who founded the Norwalk Community Quilt Project. We heard from Rosemary in Niantic, who wrote in that despite what sounds like high-stakes creative competition in her family, quilting has become a calming, welcoming space for her. She shared, learning to sew taught me that regardless of my ADD, short attention span, regardless of my lack of perfection, I can practice and learn a skill I thought I could never even begin to try. And honestly, self-awareness has translated in countless other ways. I have a strong belief there's pretty much nothing I can't learn how to do. Don't get me wrong, I'm one of them. I always knew I was smart and had talents, but I would have never dared to do anything that was out of my perfection comfort zone. Learning to quilt gave me that. Stay tuned. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we've been talking about sewing. Natalie called in earlier from Waterbury, the assistant curator of the Mattituck Museum there, and they actually have an exhibition right now on historic needlework. It's called Focus on the Makers, Samplers, Needlework, and Quilts. That's on display February 28th. We'll be sure to tweet out a link at Where We Live. Now, my next guest spent many years teaching art in after-school programs, but one day decided she wanted to teach quilting to young people. It's an art form she learned with her family. Her idea turned into the Norwalk Community Quilt Project and was the inspiration for an eventual children's book. Joining us now on Zoom is Lizzy Rockwell, children's book illustrator and author and founder of Piece by Piece. That's the Norwalk Community Quilt Project. Lizzy, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lucy. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm really fascinated by the guests you've had so far.
It's been great.
I'm learning a lot.
It's been great to hear some of our listeners calling in as well. Your book, The All Together Quilt, won the Connecticut Book Award picture book category in 2021. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So,
yes, I was really thrilled with that.
So tell us a little bit more about how you started Piece by Piece.
Well, like you said, I had been teaching as a resident artist. I've been teaching in after-school programs in Norwalk, Connecticut, where we lived at the time. And I would go into programs that existed that were run by the Housing Authority or the George Washington Carver Center and various settings. And I would come in once a week and teach art. And I was working with a primarily underserved community of kids, and a lot of kids did have stresses of gun violence or an incarcerated parent or other issues that were exhausting. And most kids had, normal home lives, but they found art to be very, very soothing, whatever their background was. And it engendered conversations that were quite revealing. And I noticed that when kids sort of had their eyes down and their hands busy, they were more likely to really open up and talk. And it reminded me of my afternoons after school working at a quilt frame with my sister in the living room, and just how relaxing that was. So I thought maybe I could create a program that worked with both kids and adults, perhaps set in a public housing community room. And I proposed it to a local foundation, and they decided to sponsor me to do this project.
We have a picture on our website, I believe, of one of the quilts that the community helped make through this project. Again, that's at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. One of the Norwalk residents involved in your community quilt project is Viola Sears, who's on the phone with us now. Viola, thank you for calling in.
Thank you.
So how long have you been quilting? And when you heard about this project, were you pretty excited to get involved?
Yes, and as I said before, Liz can tell you more about the date. I'm too young to remember the date that I joined. Because, as you get over 29 years old, it's kind of hard to remember. But nevertheless, that I enjoy working with it. And from day one, I enjoyed it. But I got in it because of my daughter was there, and I was having trouble with my hands. I couldn't half use them. So I went over to see what she was doing. And that's when I met Liz and all the gang, and they was beautiful people. And I fell in love with them at first sight. And I didn't want to leave them, and I still haven't left them.
So it's an intergenerational community project. Tell me about the children that you've been able to work with, Viola.
Well, those children, Liz gave them to us to teach. That was a joke. Those children are teaching us. The things that they can do, I could never even dream of it. I mean, they got all kind of different little designs. Take a piece of material, write on it, make anything you wouldn't even dream of, and pass it around and give it to different ones. Now, I have a piece that the littlest one gave me for Thanksgiving. She taken and wrote my name on it, drew a picture, put my name on it. Now, I'm waiting to get a quilt so I can put it in it. And I could never do it because I never could draw nothing, even going to school. I never learned how to do that. But this little kid, I don't know how old she is. She looked like she'd be about 8 or 9 years old. But she is dynamic.
It's lovely to see when children have confidence and they're happy, and when people encourage them to be creative. Lizzy, can you talk more about that relationship the children and residents like Viola are learning?
Well, I'm going to say that Viola started with us probably in 2009, and she's just a amazing mentor and community volunteer and friend to all of us. So happy you're here with me, Viola. This little child, Nicole, is 8, and she is so grateful to be there, and she makes drawings for everybody. And these are drawings with acrylic paint fabric markers. that you can draw on a piece of cotton and then heat set it with an iron, and then it's washable. It's like a silkscreen t-shirt. It's your drawing is indestructible. So we work a lot of drawings into our community quilts, and it's just a really beautiful way for to get multiple voices into a work of art, individual voices into a work of art that's communal and in the end sings in one harmony. So it's just amazing to bring these folks of all ages together and see what happens. And the quilt frame is also a great catalyst for conversation. Quilt frame is set up to look a little bit like a dining table, where you pull chairs up on either side. It's a long, wide rectangle. And so it's just a natural place to sit and chat. And like I was saying, when your eyes are down and your hands are busy, you tend to feel more relaxed having a conversation.
Viola, did you want to add to that, the conversations that you're having in these circles as you're quilting together?
She filled it all in. Anything I put in there, we just adding on to what she said.
Yeah.
Viola is, I will reveal, 93 years old, and she's had an amazing life. And as you can tell, she's a rich storyteller, and we love to hear her tales of her long and amazing and loving life.
Lizzy just described you as a storyteller, Viola. We know that quilts can also tell stories. Can you talk more about some of the quilts that you've helped make?
Well, I made all kinds. And I won't say the last one, because the last one I made, she hasn't even seen it. But next to the last one I made, I surprised her grandson with it. He came over to visit for the first time, and I think he liked the colors, the way he looked at it. So I asked him, did he want it? He put his hand on it. He didn't say anything. And so I said, it's yours. So I gave it to him. So I have another surprise for him today. Grandma don't know anything about it, so I have another surprise for him.
Oh, Viola.
And Lizzy, tell us about some of the quilts. Again, describe them for us, since we're on the radio. You mentioned as using some of the children are drawing on these particular pieces, but can you describe some of the ones that have been created for us?
Yes, I will. And I also want to say that many of our quilts are going to be on display at the Norwalk Art Space, which is on 455 Main Street West Avenue, in Norwalk, Connecticut. And there's going to be a show there of quilts and illustrations, and people will be able to see some of these gorgeous works of art that we are borrowing back from public institutions like Stepping Stones Museum, Norwalk Public Library, the Adam J. Lewis Academy. But I will create a design for one of the art quilts that's going to be installed in a public place. And I approach it as an illustrator, as a graphic designer, using typography and imagery that's symbolic. And then I find ways that there will be many voices highlighted in the patchwork. And often this is done by drawing on fabric. So that's a really nice way to get all these different points of view. The Love Quilt, which we are borrowing from the Norwalk Public Library, has the word love written over and over again, I think 5 times, in a white and red pattern. And on each patch that makes up the letters, there's a drawing done by somebody. And my prompt when I ran the drawing workshops was, show me what you love. So we got a lot of really amazing answers to that question. And then we just finished a quilt for the Adam J. Lewis Academy in Bridgeport that is the Hope Quilt. And this one has a whole bunch of beautiful drawings by children at the school and my piece by piece community about what do you hope for. And we did this during the pandemic, so it became quite meaningful and symbolic and poignant.
Jolene's calling in. Jolene, what did you want to share? We've got just a few minutes left.
I taught children for several years. I taught sewing at our local elementary school. And one of the things I'm not sure that we touched on today is the mathematical part of sewing. Just the simple, I have to have 6-inch squares. I have this piece of fabric. I need to measure it. And how many squares can I get out of that? That was one of the concepts that the kids that I taught were amazed. And it was good and a little sad in some parts. I taught kids through third grade through fifth grade. And I would have thought my fifth graders would have grasped the concept, but they would look at me like I was some sort of completely, smartest person in the world. The other thing is perseverance, true perseverance. Kids still at that age, their hand dexterity still, their hand strength isn't quite there yet. So having to cut with scissors and to be able to go around that pattern and make it turn out. So whenever I did that with the kids and they had to cut their own, I always had to make 3 for each child because I was determined that they could cut that out themselves and be able to make it look like whatever the pattern was, if we were making a small animal or even a pillow. So that part of sewing has always fascinated me, and it's what led me then to want to offer these classes to kids. It was an after-school program, and I loved it. I loved it. The kids learned so much. I had kids 3 years in a row, and they grew so much.
Well, you brought up some great points, Jolene, about problem solving and perseverance. Lizzy, did you want to add?
Thank you so much, Jolene, for mentioning this. I could talk to y'all for a few hours about this program and the many benefits, but one of the reasons I knew it would make a great picture book for elementary school age kids is because I could put in all these extension concepts about math and geometry and community building and civic volunteering. And then in the back matter, I have stuff about the origins of the various fabrics in the quilt. There's Indian block print, there's Indonesian batik, there's, African wax relief prints. So there's so many extensions, skill-wise and intellectually, that it's emotionally benefiting and it's intellectually benefiting, and it's builds community. So what is not to love about community quilting? It's just been one of the richest parts of my life.
Well, thank you, Lizzy Rockwell, for joining us again, the founder of Piece by Piece, the Norwalk Community Quilt Project. She wrote a book about the project called The All Together Quilt. It was a Connecticut Book Award winner. Lizzy, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for including me in this great conversation.
And Viola Sears called in, a Norwalk resident, a member of this Community Quilt Project. Viola, it was great to hear from you. Thank you as well. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical director is Kat Pastor. We hope you have a great weekend.